The ground trembles before you hear them. Miles north of Delhi, a farmer drops his plough. He presses his palm flat against the earth and feels it vibrate beneath his fingers like the skin of a drum. His cattle lift their heads, nostrils flaring. Birds explode from the trees in sheets of panicked wings. And then it comes, a sound that builds from the edge of silence into something monstrous. The thunder of 200,000 hooves churning the winter soil into clouds of dust that blot out the sun itself. The Mongols have come for India, but something extraordinary is about to happen here. Something that defies every expectation of the 13th century, something that will reshape the destiny of 500 million souls who haven't even been born yet. Because in the city that lies in their path, a sultan is waiting. A sultan whose name will become synonymous with one of history's most remarkable defensive victories. A sultan who, in just a few hours, will shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility and turn this frozen December morning into a graveyard for an empire. What unfolds at the Battle of Kili in 1299 is nothing less than the moment India survived, the moment when the world's most terrifying military force, undefeated across 3 continents, met its match on the dusty plains outside Delhi. And the man responsible for that victory? He wasn't born a king, he wasn't trained as a soldier, he seized his throne through blood and treachery, murdering his own uncle to claim the Sultanate just 3 years before the Mongols arrived. His name was Alauddin Khalji, and this is the story of how a usurper saved a civilization. We need to understand something about this moment, something that gets lost in the dry statistics of medieval history. We need to feel what it felt like to live in northern India in December of 1299, to wake each morning wondering if today was the day the eastern horizon would darken with death, because the Mongols weren't just an army.
We need to understand something about this moment, something that gets lost in the dry statistics of medieval history. We need to feel what it felt like to live in northern India in December of 1299, to wake each morning wondering if today was the day the eastern horizon would darken with death, because the Mongols weren't just an army. They were a force of nature, a human hurricane that had already consumed everything from Beijing to Baghdad. They had drowned nations. They had erased cities so completely that scholars still debate whether those places ever existed. And now, for the 3rd time in 2 years, they were coming for Delhi. The man leading this invasion force is Kutluk Khwaja, and he is not merely a general. He is the son of Dua Khan, supreme ruler of the Chagatai Khanate, one of the 4 great hordes that inherited Genghis Khan's fractured empire. At 23 years old, Kutluk Khwaja has never known defeat. He has grown up on a diet of conquest, nursed on stories of his grandfather's grandfather laying waste to civilizations from Korea to Poland. To him, India isn't a target, it's an entitlement. A fat, wealthy land of soft people who worship strange gods and pray to idols rather than mastering the arts of war. The chroniclers of his own army describe the upcoming campaign as less a battle than a harvest. What Kutluk Khwaja doesn't know, what he cannot possibly fathom as he leads his vast host south through the mountain passes of Afghanistan, is that Delhi has changed. The Sultanate he's about to strike isn't the fragmented, unstable kingdom his predecessors raided and humiliated just years before. Something fundamental has shifted behind those walls. Someone new sits on the throne, and that someone has been preparing for exactly this moment with a single-minded obsession that borders on madness. I want to take you back now, just briefly, to understand how we arrived at this precipice. Because the collision about to happen at Kili is the culmination of decades of mounting tension, of invasions and retreats, and a slow, grinding terror that had begun to convince the people of India that their conquest was merely a matter of time. The Mongols first appeared on India's doorstep in 1221 when Genghis Khan himself, the great Khan, the world conqueror, the man who would kill 40 million people in his lifetime, chased a fleeing prince across the Indus River. He stood on the banks of that great water and looked east toward the endless burning plains of Hindustan. His generals urged him forward. The wealth of India was legendary. The resistance would be minimal. Why stop now? And yet, incredibly, Genghis Khan turned back. Why? The chronicles offer theories. The heat was insufferable, the rivers uncrossable, the omens unfavorable. Some whisper that even the world conqueror recognized a land too vast, too hot, too strange to absorb. But whatever his reasons, that decision granted India 7 decades of fragile peace. 7 decades, during which the Mongol Empire expanded everywhere else, swallowing China, crushing Persia, sacking Baghdad, and drowning the Abbasid Caliphate in rivers of blood. 7 decades during which India watched and waited and wondered when its turn would come. It came in 1241, when a Mongol army swept into the Punjab and sacked Lahore, butchering its inhabitants and leaving the city a smoking ruin. It came again in 1285, again in 1292, again in 1297, probing attacks, each one deeper, each one more devastating, each one testing the defenses of the Delhi Sultanate and finding them wanting. By the time Alauddin Khalji seized power in 1296, the pattern was grimly established. The Mongols would come, they would raid, they would plunder, they would burn, and the Sultanate would survive only because the Mongols chose to withdraw, never because Delhi could force them to. This is the inheritance that Alauddin Khalji claimed when he murdered his uncle and took the throne. This is the kingdom he ruled, a kingdom living on borrowed time, haunted by an enemy it could not defeat, ruled by a succession of sultans who had bought peace with gold rather than earning it with steel. But Alauddin Khalji was different. I find myself drawn to this man in ways I didn't expect when I first encountered his story. He's not likable. He's not admirable by any conventional standard. The list of his crimes: fratricide, imprisonment of nobles without trial, brutal extraction of wealth from his subjects, torture of his enemies, reads like the resume of a tyrant. And yet something in his eyes, if we can trust the poets who describe them, burned with a ferocity that transcended mere cruelty. He understood, with a clarity that his predecessors lacked, that survival itself was the only virtue that mattered, that a kingdom exists or it does not, and all other considerations are luxury. When the Mongol threat appeared on his horizon in 1296, just months after he claimed the throne, Alauddin Khalji made a choice that would define his reign. He would not negotiate, he would not bribe, he would not hope the storm passed him by, as it had so many times before. He would prepare, and preparation for Alauddin Khalji meant transformation. First came the army. The Sultan recognized that the Sultanate's military forces were too small, too poorly equipped, and too unreliable to face the Mongol host. So he built a new one. Historians estimate that within 3 years, he expanded his military from roughly 75,000 soldiers to nearly 500,000, the largest standing army in the medieval Islamic world. To pay for this force, he instituted a tax system of unprecedented brutality, extracting half of all agricultural produce from his subjects and seizing the wealth of Hindu temples and merchant families with equal ruthlessness. When nobles protested, he reminded them that empty treasuries built empty graves. When peasants starved, he reminded them that living under Mongol rule would be worse. Second came the intelligence network. Alauddin established a system of spies and informants that blanketed his kingdom and extended into the territories beyond. Merchants, travelers, refugees, all were questioned, bribed, or threatened until they revealed what they knew. Within months, the Sultan knew more about Mongol troop movements, command structures, and logistical chains than any ruler in India's history. He knew their generals by name. He knew their rivalries and weaknesses. He knew when they were coming before they even left their staging grounds. Third, and perhaps most importantly, came the fortifications. Alauddin understood that Delhi itself was the prize, and he ringed his capital with a system of defensive works that would have impressed the Roman legions. New walls rose from the earth. Old walls were reinforced. Granaries were stockpiled with years of provisions. Wells were dug, cisterns filled, armories stocked with arrows beyond counting. The city became a fortress, a bristling, watchful bastion that could survive a siege of months, perhaps years, waiting for the Mongols to exhaust themselves against its stones. But here's what made Alauddin Khalji truly dangerous, what separated him from every sultan who had come before. He didn't intend to merely survive, he intended to win. To understand what that meant, we have to understand how the Mongols fought, how they had conquered half the known world with an army that looked, to European and Asian observers alike, almost laughably primitive. The Mongol warrior carried a curved bow and a quiver of arrows. He rode a small, shaggy horse, often 2 or 3 of them, switching mounts to maintain speed across vast distances. He wore little armor, carried minimal supplies, and seemed by every conventional measure to be outclassed by the heavily armored knights and infantry of the civilizations he faced. And yet those civilizations fell, one after another, because the Mongols fought with a tactical sophistication that no one understood until it was too late. The key was mobility. A Mongol army could cover 50 miles in a day, appearing from nowhere and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. They used feigned retreats, pretending to flee in terror, drawing their enemies into disorganized pursuits, then wheeling around and annihilating the scattered, exhausted foe. They employed psychological warfare with a precision that bordered on the demonic, slaughtering entire populations to spread terror ahead of their advance, then offering mercy to cities that surrendered without a fight, creating impossible choices for defenders who knew that resistance meant death, but also knew that surrender meant subjugation. Against such tactics, the conventional armies of the medieval world had proven helpless. The kingdoms of Central Asia had tried to fight and died. The Khwarezmian Empire, once the mightiest power in the Islamic world, had fielded 400,000 soldiers against Genghis Khan and been erased from history within 3 years. The Song dynasty of China, with its million-strong armies and sophisticated technology, had held out for decades before finally succumbing. The Abbasid Caliphate, center of Islamic civilization for 500 years, had lasted exactly 1 siege before Baghdad fell and the last caliph was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. This was the enemy Alauddin Khalji prepared to face. This was the force that had broken every kingdom, brave or foolish enough to stand against it, and somehow, impossibly, he believed he could win. The first test came in 1299, on a winter morning, when the scouts rode into Delhi with news that made even the hardened veterans of the palace guard turn pale. A Mongol army had crossed the mountains, not a raiding party, not a probing force. An army, 200,000 strong, led by the son of the Khan himself, marching directly toward the capital with clear intent to conquer. Let me stop here and make something clear about that number. Because 200,000 is the figure the chroniclers give us, and it sounds almost absurdly large. Modern historians debate whether it should be taken literally or understood as a general term for a vast host. Perhaps the real number was 150,000 or 100,000 or even 80,000. It doesn't matter. What matters is that this was the largest Mongol force ever to invade India. What matters is that it dwarfed anything the Delhi Sultanate could field in response. What matters is that when Alauddin Khalji heard the count, he knew he was facing extinction, and he smiled. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. A man standing in the great hall of his palace, surrounded by ministers and generals whose faces have gone gray with fear, receiving news that the apocalypse is approaching, and smiling. Not in madness, not in denial, in recognition. It was the moment he had prepared for. This was the enemy he had spent 3 years arming against. The Mongols had finally committed their full strength, and now he would have the chance to destroy them once and for all. But first, he had to survive the next 72 hours. The Mongol advance moved with terrifying speed. Kutlu Khwaja had learned from his predecessor's failures. He knew that speed was everything, that every day of delay gave the Indians time to muster, to fortify, to prepare. His horsemen swept across the Punjab in a matter of days, brushing aside local resistance like a man scattering insects. By the time the full scope of the invasion became clear, the Mongol vanguard was already approaching the outer reaches of the Delhi Sultanate's heartland. Alauddin Khalji faced a choice that would determine the fate of his kingdom. He could retreat behind Delhi's walls and wait, trusting his fortifications and his stores to outlast the siege. This was the safe option, the conventional wisdom of defensive warfare. Let the enemy exhaust himself against stone and time. But Alauddin understood something his advisors did not. The Mongols hadn't come to besiege, they had come to conquer. If he hid behind his walls, they would simply bypass him, ravaging the countryside, destroying the agricultural base that fed his army and his city. Within weeks, Delhi would be an island in a sea of ashes, surrounded by a population that had learned their sultan couldn't protect them. His kingdom would crumble from within before the first Mongol arrow ever struck his walls. No. He would meet them in the field. The decision sent shockwaves through the court. No Sultanate army had ever stood against a major Mongol invasion in open battle, not successfully. The mathematics of warfare seemed to demand defeat. The Mongols were more numerous, more experienced, more mobile. They had defeated every army that ever tried what Alauddin was proposing. To march out and fight was to invite annihilation. But Alauddin Khalji wasn't proposing a fair fight. We need to talk now about a man whose name deserves to be remembered alongside history's greatest warriors. A man whose courage at the Battle of Kili would become legendary in Indian military history, and whose death would be mourned as the price of victory. His name was Malik Zafar Khan, and he was Alauddin's greatest general. Everything about Zafar Khan seemed designed for war. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could carry across a battlefield and arms thick as tree limbs, he had risen through the Sultanate's military ranks on pure martial prowess. He was said to wield a sword so heavy that lesser men couldn't lift it. He was said to ride into battle at the head of his troops, never behind them. He was said to fear nothing on earth, not death, not pain, not even the Mongols themselves. This last quality was about to be tested beyond imagining. Alauddin gave Zafar Khan command of the vanguard, the first wave of the Sultanate's army that would march out to meet the Mongol advance. Behind him would come the main force, led by another general named Ulu Khan, the Sultan's own brother, and behind that, in reserve, would come Alauddin himself with his personal guard, the hammer that would strike when the moment was right. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its demands. Zafar Khan would engage the Mongol vanguard, drawing them into battle, fixing them in place. Ulu Khan would swing around to strike the flank, and when the Mongols committed their reserves to meet this threat, Alauddin would appear with his fresh troops and crush them between three converging forces. But every officer in that war council knew the unspoken truth. For the plan to work, Zafar Khan would have to hold. Not just fight, hold. Against the most mobile army on earth, against horsemen trained from childhood to wheel and strike and vanish, Zafar Khan would have to plant his feet and refuse to break no matter what the Mongols threw at him. The general accepted the assignment without hesitation. On the morning of the battle, the Sultanate's army marched out from Delhi in a column that stretched for miles. Cavalry and infantry, archers and siege engineers, camp followers and supply wagons. A river of humanity flowing north toward the Mongol host. The winter sun hung low and cold in a sky of perfect blue. Dust rose from the column and drifted across the fallow fields. And in the distance, barely visible on the northern horizon, another cloud of dust was growing. The two armies made contact near the village of Kili, roughly 15 miles from Delhi's walls, close enough that the outcome of the battle would determine the city's fate within hours. The terrain here was flat, open ground that seemed to favor the Mongol cavalry's mobility. Stands of scrub trees dotted the landscape, but there were no natural choke points, no rivers or hills to anchor a defensive line. This was killing ground, pure and simple. Kutlo Khwaja surveyed the Indian formation from horseback and felt something close to contempt. He could see their lines spreading across the plain, infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, banners flapping in the morning breeze. It was a textbook formation, exactly what the manuals of medieval warfare prescribed. And it was exactly what the Mongols had shattered 100 times before. The young commander issued his orders. The Mongol army began to deploy. What happened next would be remembered for 7 centuries. The Mongol host spread across the plain like a dark tide, unit after unit, emerging from the dust cloud and taking position. To the Indians watching from their lines, it must have seemed endless. Wave after wave of horsemen, their small ponies jostling and stamping, their curved bows already strung and ready. The noise was overwhelming, the thunder of hooves, the shouts of commanders, the eerie, ululating cry that Mongol warriors used to coordinate their movements across the vast distances of the steppe. Zafar Khan sat motionless on his horse at the center of the vanguard, watching the enemy deploy. His officers clustered around him, their faces tight with tension. One of them, we don't know his name, only that he was young and had never seen Mongols before, turned to the general and asked, with a voice that barely hid its trembling, "What do we do?" Zafar Khan pointed at the largest knot of enemy cavalry, where the banners of Kutluk Khwaja's personal guard rippled in the wind. "You see that standard? That is where we strike first. Stay behind me and kill everyone in your path. Do not stop, do not hesitate, do not retreat unless I am dead." The young officer swallowed. "And if you die, sir?" Zafar Khan turned to look at him, and something in the general's eyes made the junior officer wish he hadn't asked. "Then you will have more room to swing your sword." The first clash came at mid-morning, when the Mongol-like cavalry swept forward in a feigned attack, the classic opening gambit of steppe warfare. Thousands of horsemen charged toward the Indian lines, loosing arrows in deadly clouds, then wheeling away before contact. The tactic had worked against armies from China to Hungary. It was designed to provoke, to draw defenders out of formation, to create gaps that the heavy cavalry could exploit. Zafar Khan had studied this maneuver. He had spoken to survivors of previous Mongol incursions, poring over their accounts until he understood exactly what the enemy was trying to accomplish, and he had trained his men to resist it. The Sultanate's lines held. Arrow after arrow slammed into the Indian formation. Horses screamed and fell. Men died where they stood, but the lines held. Zafar Khan's discipline, drilled into his troops over months of brutal training, paid its dividends in the blood of soldiers who absorbed the punishment and refused to break. Kutluk Khwaja frowned. He ordered a second wave of harassers forward, then a third. Each time the Mongol riders swept close, unleashing their deadly salvos, then retreating to reform. Each time the Indian lines rippled but did not shatter. The young Khan had expected panic by now. He had expected the enemy to charge in disorder or to flee back toward Delhi. Instead, they simply stood there, bleeding, dying, and holding. Something was wrong. The Mongol commander made a decision. If the Indians wouldn't break, he would simply overwhelm them. He signaled for the main assault. What Zafar Khan saw next would have broken lesser men. The entire Mongol line lurched forward, not the light cavalry probing attacks of before, but the full weight of the horde, a wall of horses and steel and fury rolling toward his position like a tidal wave of death. The ground shook. The noise became a physical force, pressing against his ears, filling his chest. He could see individual faces now, twisted with the bloodlust of warriors who had never known defeat, coming to add his skull to their collection. Zafar Khan drew his sword and charged. The Indians met the Mongol assault head-on, the two armies colliding with a sound like the world breaking. Within seconds, the organized lines dissolved into chaos. Thousands of individual combats swirling across the plain, horses rearing and screaming, swords rising and falling, men dying in sprays of blood that turned the winter dust into crimson mud. In the center of this maelstrom, Zafar Khan fought like something out of legend. The chroniclers who recorded this battle, even the skeptical ones, the court historians trained to filter their sources for exaggeration, all agree that what the general did that morning defied belief. He carved a path directly toward Kutluk Khwaja's banner, killing everyone in his way, his massive sword scything through Mongol warriors like wheat before the harvest. His personal guard tried to keep pace, but he was moving too fast, riding too far ahead, throwing himself deeper and deeper into the enemy formation, and impossibly, miraculously, the Mongols began to give ground. We need to understand what this moment meant. In nearly a century of Mongol conquest, no one had done this. No army had met their charge and pushed them back. No general had broken their momentum through sheer aggression. The Mongol warriors, raised from birth to believe themselves invincible, found themselves facing something they had never encountered, an enemy who simply refused to be afraid. Zafar Khan's charge shattered something in the Mongol center, not their formation, which was too disciplined to collapse entirely, but their confidence. For the first time in the battle, Kutluk Khwaja's officers began sending urgent messages requesting reinforcement. For the first time, Mongol units began executing tactical withdrawals that looked dangerously close to retreat. For the first time, the outcome of the battle appeared uncertain. On the flanks, Khan was executing his part of the plan with brutal efficiency. The Sultan's brother had brought a force of heavy cavalry around the edge of the battlefield, and now it slammed into the Mongol right wing with the force of an avalanche. The Mongols there, already shaken by the unexpected resistance in the center, found themselves fighting on two fronts. Their mobile tactics, which required room to maneuver, became impossible in the press of bodies. They were forced into the close-quarters combat that favored the heavier Indian cavalry, where individual skill and brute strength mattered more than mounted archery. The battle was turning, but Zafar Khan had pressed too far. We'll never know exactly what happened in the chaos of that Mongol center. The general and his surviving guardsmen were surrounded, cut off from the main Indian force, fighting back-to-back in a shrinking circle of steel and desperation. A messenger broke through the chaos to reach Khan, gasping out news of the general's predicament. The Sultan's brother faced an impossible choice: pull forces from the flank attack to rescue Zafar Khan, potentially losing the advantage they had gained, or continue the offensive and let the empire's greatest warrior die alone. Khan chose victory. Some historians have condemned this decision. Others have praised it as the cold calculation that won the battle. What we know is that Zafar Khan fought on, alone, for nearly an hour after his last guardsman fell. The Mongols, who prized courage above all virtues, began to hold back from attacking him directly, not from mercy, but from something closer to awe. This single man, unhorsed and surrounded, continued to kill anyone who approached him. His sword arm never tired, his movements never slowed. He was death made flesh, and even the hardened steppe warriors hesitated to approach death. In the end, it took a volley of arrows from multiple directions to bring him down. Zafar Khan fell to his knees, pierced through torso and throat, and still, he managed to cut one last attacker before he collapsed. The Mongols who recovered his body found him clutching his sword so tightly that they had to break his fingers to pry it loose. His death bought something priceless: time. While Zafar Khan made his last stand, Alauddin Khalji committed his reserves. The Sultan had watched the battle from a slight rise behind the lines, surrounded by his personal guard and the elite cavalry he had held back for exactly this moment. He had seen the Mongol center buckle under Zafar Khan's assault. He had seen his brother's flanking attack drive deep into the enemy's right, and he had seen the opportunity that his general's courage had created: a momentary gap in the Mongol coordination, a window of confusion in which a fresh assault could shatter the invasion entirely. Alauddin drew his own sword and raised it high. The reserves began to move. 20,000 fresh cavalrymen, their horses rested and their arms strong, slammed into the Mongol formation at exactly the moment when Kutluk Khwaja's forces were most extended. The impact was devastating. Mongol units that had been pressing forward suddenly found themselves hit from the side and rear. The coordination that made their army so deadly collapsed into chaos as officers lost contact with each other, and individual units began making independent decisions. Some fighting, some retreating, some trying desperately to reform. Kutlu Khwaja, for the first time in his life, experienced the sensation of losing. By late afternoon, the Mongol army began to break. It started slowly at first. Individual warriors slipping away from the fighting, melting back toward the northern horizon. Then larger groups began to retreat, first in orderly fashion, and then in open flight. Within an hour, the trickle had become a flood. The greatest Mongol invasion of India was collapsing, its warriors streaming northward in the same columns that had approached so confidently just that morning. Alauddin Khalji could have let them go. The kingdom was saved, the threat was ended, pursuit was risky, the Mongols were still dangerous, still capable of turning on their pursuers if pressed too hard. Many of his advisors urged caution, restraint, the quiet celebration of survival. The Sultan chose differently. He ordered a pursuit that would become infamous for its brutality. For 3 days, Indian cavalry hunted the fleeing Mongol army, cutting down stragglers, capturing supply trains, turning the retreat into a massacre. Kutlu Khwaja himself barely escaped, his personal guard decimated, his army destroyed, his dreams of conquest scattered across the blood-soaked plains of northern India. The numbers that emerged from the battle are staggering. Contemporary chroniclers claim that 20,000 Mongol prisoners were captured, and every single one of them was executed. The heads were stacked in pyramids outside Delhi's walls, a message to any future invader about what awaited those who threatened the Sultanate. Zafar Khan's body was recovered from the battlefield and brought back to Delhi with full honors. Alauddin Khalji, whatever his faults, understood the debt he owed to the general who had given everything for victory. The Sultan ordered a magnificent tomb constructed for his fallen commander, and tradition holds that he visited that tomb often in the years that followed, standing in silence before the grave of the man who had made his kingdom's survival possible. But I want to step back from the immediate aftermath and ask a different question. What did the Battle of Kili mean, not just for Alauddin Khalji and his kingdom, but for the history of India itself, for the hundreds of millions of people who would live in that subcontinent over the centuries to come? Because the Mongol invasions of India weren't academic exercises. They weren't contests between armies that would end with handshakes and new borders. They were existential threats, the same kind of existential threats that had already erased civilizations from the map of history. When the Mongols conquered, they didn't merely rule, they depopulated. They destroyed infrastructure that had taken centuries to build. They killed so many people that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere dropped measurably. India, by the grace of generals like Zafar Khan and sultans like Alauddin Khalji, was spared this fate. Think about what that means. Think about the temples that weren't burned, the cities that weren't razed, the scholars who weren't killed, the knowledge that wasn't lost. Think about the centuries of Indian civilization that continued unbroken, the Mongol Empire, the Maratha Confederacy, the rich cultural traditions that survived to be shared with the world. All of it hung in the balance on that December morning in 1299. All of it could have ended with a Mongol victory at Kili. The Mongols would return to India. They would never stop trying. But after Kili, something had changed. The myth of inevitability was broken. Indian kingdoms knew now that the Mongols could be beaten, not just survived, but beaten, their armies shattered, their ambitions crushed. The last major Mongol incursion into India came in 1306, when another massive army crossed the mountains and descended toward Delhi. Alauddin met this threat as he had met all the others, with overwhelming force and merciless violence. The Battle of Amroha, fought that year, was another decisive Indian victory. The Mongol commander was captured, brought to Delhi in chains, and publicly executed. After that, the invasion simply stopped. He implemented economic reforms that were centuries ahead of their time. Price controls, market regulation, standardized taxation, all in service of maintaining the massive military that kept the Mongols at bay. He was loved by his soldiers and feared by everyone else. And yet, as often happens with tyrants, his end was neither glorious nor gentle. In 1316, Alauddin fell ill, poisoned, some whispered, by his own trusted general, a man named Malik Kafur, who had risen from slavery to become the Sultan's closest confidant. The poison worked slowly, giving Kafur time to maneuver, to position himself to seize power after the Sultan's death. When Alauddin finally died, Kafur moved immediately to eliminate the royal family and claim the throne for himself. He lasted 35 days before the palace guard murdered him. The Khalji dynasty survived Alauddin by only a few years before being replaced by the Tughlaqs, who ruled for the next century before they too fell to internal strife and external pressure. Such is the nature of medieval kingdoms. Empires rise and fall, dynasties flourish and wither, names that once commanded the terror of millions fade into footnotes in history books. But the achievement of Kili endured. I find myself returning to the image of Zafar Khan in his final moments, surrounded, bleeding, impossibly fighting on against odds that would have broken any other warrior. There's something in that image that transcends the specific circumstances of a medieval battle, something that speaks to the deepest questions of human courage and sacrifice. He knew he was going to die. He must have known from the moment he charged too deep into the Mongol formation, from the moment he saw his guardsmen falling around him, from the moment he found himself alone in a sea of enemies. And yet he kept fighting. Not because he thought he would win. He was too experienced a soldier for that kind of delusion. But because every moment he continued to fight, every enemy he forced to deal with him instead of pressing the attack on the main Indian line, every second he bought with his blood was a second closer to victory for his kingdom. That is what sacrifice looks like. The Mongols understood this. It's why they hesitated to approach him at the end. It's why they treated his body with a respect they rarely showed defeated enemies. They had conquered nations, shattered armies, humbled emperors, but they had never encountered anything quite like Zafar Khan. The Mongols weren't defeated by superior numbers, or by clever tactics, or by defensive advantages. They were defeated by men who simply refused to be defeated, who looked at the most terrifying military force in human history and decided that dying was preferable to submission. The dust has settled now on those plains outside Delhi. The bones of the fallen have long since crumbled to nothing. The tombs where Zafar Khan and Alauddin Khalji sleep have weathered and worn and been restored and forgotten and rediscovered by generations of historians seeking to understand what happened in that distant December. But something of that day lingers. Walk through Delhi today, through the crowded streets and the ancient monuments and the palaces that rose after Alauddin's time, and you walk through a city that exists because of choices made 700 years ago. The Mongols came for India. India was ready. And the world we live in, a world where Indian civilization survived to become a nation of 1 billion souls, is the world that emerged from that December morning when a sultan smiled at doom and a general rode into legend.